Imagine waking up only to realize that the person looking back at you in the mirror isn't you. Or perhaps realizing that the memories of yesterday belong to someone else entirely. It's one of the most chilling, controversial, and often exploited psychological conditions in Hollywood history. The ultimate plot device in thrillers like Split and Sybil. We're talking about dissociative identity disorder, or DID for short, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Is it a rare, true occurrence, or a highly debated cultural phenomenon? How does a mind become fractured? Can those fragments ever truly become whole again? And more importantly, is any of this real? Today, we're digging deep to separate the Hollywood horror from the clinical reality on Your Mind On Dissociative Identity Disorder. And welcome back, everyone, to another week here on Your Mind On, a podcast where I, John Shaw, pick a topic within the world of psychology each week and do a deep dive into the research and present what I found to all of you. And to any of our first-time listeners out there, welcome. Make yourself comfortable, and I hope you enjoy. I hope you've all had a great week, and to the listeners here in the U.S., I hope you had a fantastic Thanksgiving. And I also hope that last week's episode helped you come up with some strategies for managing that holiday stress. I had a great holiday traveling with my wife, my stepson, and my mother-in-law to visit my side of the family and enjoy a great meal with family in Idaho. And now it's time to dig back in and focus on our journey into the human mind and learning about all of the interesting things. And what better way to do that than to go big this week as we dive into the first disorder that we've covered here on the podcast. Please be sure to follow the show on your preferred podcast platform so you never miss out on a new episode. Episodes are released every Thursday, which I've begun thinking of as Thoughtful Thursdays. And please leave comments or ratings as it'll help the show continue to grow. The website is officially up and running. You can stream the podcast directly from the website if that's a preference for you. And I'm going to continue updating the site as much as I can to make it a better experience. And you can also follow the podcast now on Instagram. Links to the website and Instagram information are in the show notes, as well as the email address that you can use to reach out with any questions or comments you might have, as well as topic suggestions that you'd like to have me cover on the show. And now on to our topic for today, dissociative identity disorder. This is going to be our biggest episode yet, since there's a lot of information to go over, and I hope you find it just as fascinating as I have. So what is dissociative identity disorder? As I said in the intro, dissociative identity disorder, known as DID for short, was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. For me at least, this was one of the first psychological disorders that I really knew much about. It is one of the most often and most easily exploited disorders in popular culture. It's been used in movies and television to scare us. But what is it really, and how does it occur? DID is characterized by the presence of at least two distinct and enduring personality traits. The International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11, defines DID as an involuntary disruption in the normal integration of identity, sensations, perceptions, memory, and control over bodily movements. In DID, these disruptions manifest as different identity states, which patients may refer to using a variety of terms, including alters, parts, selves, aspects, or even voices. This fragmentation is not a willful act, but a deeply ingrained psychological defense mechanism. When you break DID down, there are 5 primary symptoms, or maybe traits is a better name for them. First is the disruption of identity. People with dissociative identity disorder have 2 distinct personalities, But these aren't just changes in the way these people interact with others. Each personality state typically has its own behavior patterns, names, and even histories. And these distinct personality states can have its own gender, age, and even temperament. So if you've ever seen a movie where someone has DID, such as Split, they really nail this part of the diagnosis. One minute you might be talking to a middle-aged man, and then the personality switches, and while you're still looking at a middle-aged man, you find yourself talking to maybe an adolescent girl. Second is dissociative amnesia. After a switch, people with DID may have the inability to recall important personal information, everyday events, or traumatic experiences that is far more extensive than ordinary forgetfulness. They might experience lost time and often do not remember anything that happened while in a different personality state. A third trait is intrusions and alterations. While the first two traits are most often highlighted in pop culture, intrusions and alterations can be a pretty profound trait. It occurs when the person has unbidden intrusions into their awareness, similar to how schizophrenia manifests. They will have thoughts, emotions, or impulses that they feel are not their own or are alien to them. They might feel detached from their own body as if they are watching their actions rather than experiencing them, or feeling that the world around them is foggy or unreal. This is often seen as an interaction between two personality states, where one state might be thinking one thing and have an intrusive thought that is completely foreign to them and tagged as coming from the alternate personality. The next trait is loss of agency. This is essentially the next step beyond intrusions and alterations. During a loss of agency, the sufferer usually feels as if they are being fully controlled by an alternate personality, and they are left watching as someone else controls their movements, thoughts, and behaviors, and they have no way of stopping it or controlling it. And the last is functional impairment. To meet diagnostic criteria, the symptoms must be severe enough to cause significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, personal, or other important areas of functioning. The disturbance is not considered part of an accepted cultural or religious practice and cannot be attributed to the effects of a substance or another medical condition. As these traits were observed, studied, and documented, the terminology shifted from multiple personality disorder to dissociative identity disorder. In the past, it was referred to as multiple personality disorder because it was believed that there were multiple fully formed personalities residing within one person's mind. But as the clinical understanding grew, it became accepted that rather than being multiple fully formed personalities, it was in fact one personality that had been severely fractured, with each personality state retaining some aspects of the personality, while the other state or states would retain other aspects entirely. The core fundamental of the disorder is that the fractured personality states are not able to integrate back into one personality. The easiest way I can explain this is through the course of our own lives every day. We experience shifts in our personality or experiences. During the course of a day, you might be a sports fanatic watching your team on television. You find yourself cheering, yelling at the TV, groaning with bad plays, cheering the good ones, and you're fully immersed in the game. Later that day, after the game, you're driving home, and there's a lot of traffic with people cutting you off, not using turn signals, or whatever the case might be, and you find yourself getting angry, tense, and stressed out. Then later, you're at home sharing dinner with someone special, and all of your thoughts are on enjoying the meal and the good company. Here we see three distinct personalities: the sports fan, the road rager, and the romantic. But they are entirely a part of who we are. We shift between these states normally, we remember each of them, and we understand that they make up who we are as a whole. Someone with DID experiences things much the same way. However, the key difference is that the sports fan, the road rage, and the romantic would seem in their own minds to be three separate people. The romantic might not even remember watching a sports game. The road rager can't even imagine sitting down to a lovely meal with someone that they care about. They are, for all intents and purposes, different people sharing one body. As you can see, this makes diagnosing and treating DID extremely difficult and even controversial. But to fully understand DID, we need to look at the history and evolution of the diagnosis. The disorder's evolution is deeply intertwined with shifts in psychiatric theory, influential cultural events, and public perception. The journey from a rarely noted curiosity to a recognized but contentious diagnosis reflects the broader struggles within mental health to understand the impact of trauma on the human psyche. The roots of the disorder can be traced back to the 19th century in France, with concepts like double consciousness and studies of hysteria with psychological pioneers like Pierre Janel and Morton Prince, with Prince's case of Christine Beauchamp providing a detailed look at a patient with multiple distinct personality states. The diagnosis of DID took a major hit, however, in the 20th century when Eugene Bleuler developed the concept of schizophrenia. The concept of schizophrenia was extremely broad and eventually absorbed many of the dissociative disorders. And because of this, many cases of DID were misdiagnosed as schizophrenia. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that the concept of DID began to regain some traction, but this time it wasn't psychologists or research that brought the concept back into the limelight. Popular culture was solely responsible for the reemergence. The book and subsequent movie, The Three Faces of Eve, brought the concept of multiple personalities within one person back into the public consciousness. The story depicted the treatment of Chris Costner Sizemore. The movie itself ends with the celebrated fusion of the multiple personalities into one central personality. In true Hollywood fashion, they took an extremely complicated psychological diagnosis with an equally complicated treatment and summed it up in a rapid conclusion. The real Sizemore, yes, the book and movie were based on an actual case, stated in later autobiographies that the fusion portrayed in the story did not last, and that rather than the three distinct personalities portrayed in the story, she actually had 22. Rather than a quick breakthrough treatment, it took years for Sizemore to achieve a lasting and stable recovery through intensive therapy. It was this discrepancy between fictional portrayals and reality that has led to a lot of misunderstanding about the disorder itself. And this trend continued after the release of the book Sybil in 1974. The book follows the treatment of a woman with 16 distinct personalities. It was such a widely popular story that it actually led to what is referred to as an epidemic of the diagnosis. To make matters worse, the case that Sybil was based on was later found to be nearly entirely fraudulent. Many of the distinct personalities were actually found to have been inadvertently shaped by the therapist during treatment using suggestive techniques like sodium pentanol injections. These suggestive techniques were used in a process known as recovered memory, which has been problematic in society ever since. The largest examples of this would be what is known as the Satanic Panic in the 1980s and led to a lot of issues there. One case of the use of recovered memories in therapy resulted in a daycare facility coming under fire because children were, quote unquote, remembering satanic rituals being conducted at the daycare. These were not true memories, but were instead constructed inadvertently by therapists and led to the daycare and staff facing legal problems as well as issues in society. Recovered memory techniques have also been used to try to prove the existence of alien abduction and reincarnation, which have also been heavily debated and argued as therapists and researchers essentially implanting memories using guiding techniques rather than recovering actual memories. Within the psychological community, DID has undergone a lengthy transformation. When it was first truly introduced in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, DSM, which is sort of the glossary of psychological disorders, it was not listed as its own disorder, but rather it was lumped into a disorder called hysterical neurosis dissociative type. With the release of DSM-3 in 1980, the diagnosis was more formally introduced as multiple personality disorder, MPD, which led to a drastic increase in the number of diagnoses, especially with the increase in use of recovered memories and the satanic panic. In 1994, the DSM-4 was released, and with it came a change to the name from MPD to Dissociative Identity Disorder to better encompass the core concept of identity fragmentation, and it also added amnesia as a required diagnostic criteria. And finally, in the DSM-5, which was released in 2013, to include possession form phenomena, to allow identity transitions to be self-reported rather than only observed, and that memory gaps can occur during any daily event and not just triggered by trauma. So as the diagnosis evolved over time, it would draw followers and interest for a period of time, and then it would be overtaken by skepticism and doubt, only to regain interest again in a pretty vicious cycle, and this has led directly to the modern debate as to how legitimate the diagnosis actually is. So now that we know the history of DID, or at least the diagnosis and study, how does this extremely rare condition actually happen? What can possibly cause the human mind to fracture into different personalities? Well, just like the disorder itself, this is an extremely complicated set of questions and is one of the largest debates within the psychiatric and psychological world. The debate is framed by two competing theories. The first theory is the trauma model. The trauma model is the most widely accepted perspective in clinical guidelines and proposes that DID is a complex psychological response to severe, repetitive, and often life-threatening childhood trauma, typically occurring between the ages of 5 and 6. Under this model, when a child faces this kind of trauma, dissociation happens as a sort of protective mechanism that allows the child to escape unbearable circumstances. The main evidence and arguments that support the trauma model are 1. High correlation with trauma. A vast body of research consistently shows that between 90 and 99% of all individuals diagnosed with DID report credible histories of severe childhood abuse, including sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, and or neglect. 2. Dissociation as a coping mechanism. The model posits that in the face of inescapable and overwhelming trauma, a child may use dissociation to compartmentalize traumatic memories, overwhelming emotions, and physical sensations. This allows the child to wall off the traumatic experience, enabling other parts of the personality to continue functioning and developing. Next is developmental failure of integration. Overwhelming trauma during critical developmental years is believed to disrupt the normal process of forming a unified, cohesive sense of self. Instead of integrating various states of consciousness, memories, and emotions, the child develops discrete, personified behavioral states that evolve over time into the alternate identities characterized in DID. And the last one is neurobiological evidence. Neuroimaging studies of individuals with DID have identified trauma-related abnormalities in brain structure and function. Specifically, research has shown reduced volume in the hippocampus, which is critical for memory, and the amygdala, which is central to emotional processing, as well as alterations in the frontal lobe, which is associated with executive functioning, self-regulation, and identity. The trauma model is the most widely endorsed by major clinical bodies such as the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, or ISSTD, and forms the basis for most recommended treatment plans. The competing theory is the Sociocognitive Model. This model argues that DID is not a post-traumatic condition. Instead, it proposes that DID is a socially constructed phenomena that results from iatrogenic or therapist-induced, cultural, and media influences acting on highly suggestible and fantasy-prone individuals. The key arguments supporting this model are iatrogenesis. Proponents argue that some therapists can inadvertently create or shape DID symptoms through the use of suggestive techniques. This includes asking leading questions about alters, using hypnosis to recover memories, and reinforcing the idea of multiple selves, thereby legitimizing the patient's enactment of the DID role. The second one is sociocultural and media influence. So SCM points to the dramatic spike in DID diagnoses following popular media portrayals like Sybil. It is argued that these portrayals provide powerful cultural scripts for how individuals with DID are expected to think, feel, and behave. The recent rise in self-diagnosed DID on social media platforms like TikTok is cited as modern evidence of this phenomenon. The next one is suggestibility and fantasy proneness. Research has indicated that individuals who present with DID symptoms often score highly on scales of hypnotizability, suggestibility, and being prone to fantasies. The SCM posits that these traits make them more vulnerable to internalizing external suggestions from therapists and media. Next is skepticism of recovered memories. The SCM challenges the validity of memories of abuse that are recalled only after therapy begins. It suggests that these may be false memories inadvertently constructed during the therapeutic process rather than accurate recollections of past events. In response, the ISSTD guidelines assert a lack of empirical evidence for creating the stable, complex, and enduring phenomenology of DID through suggestion alone, distinguishing it from transient role-played states that may be elicited in suggestible individuals. There is a third perspective that actually serves to kind of bridge between the two different models, and that is the hypnotic model. This model suggests that traumatized individuals use what's known as auto-hypnosis, or the ability to hypnotize themselves, as a defense against prolonged severe trauma. The repeated, prolonged use of auto-hypnosis can lead to the creation of multiple distinct personalities. Essentially, this model says that the disorder is caused by severe and prolonged trauma through the use of suggestibility, which combines the trauma model and the sociocognitive model pretty well. So now this leads us to diagnosis. Diagnosing dissociative identity disorder is extremely complicated and difficult. Research indicates that people with the disorder will spend on average 6.5 to 8 years in the mental health system and will receive on average 2.8 separate diagnoses before they are correctly diagnosed with DID. This delay is often attributable to a lack of clinical education on dissociation, the subtle presentation of symptoms in many individuals, and the fact that standard diagnostic interviews frequently omit direct questions about trauma and dissociative experiences. A huge problem with this delay in correctly identifying the disorder is that it can lead to ineffective or even counterproductive treatment plans, which inevitably leads to longer suffering for the patient. It's difficult to properly diagnose DID because DID shares symptoms and characteristics with many other disorders. For example, people with schizophrenia and people with DID both may experience auditory hallucinations such as hearing voices. The key difference here, though, is with schizophrenia, the voices are most often experienced or reported to be coming from outside of the person's head, while the voices heard by someone with DID are generally believed to be coming from inside their own mind. Personality or mood shifts occur in DID, but these also happen in bipolar disorder. However, with DID, these shifts or switches occur spontaneously, and it can happen multiple times per day, where personality or mood shifts with bipolar disorder often take days or even weeks, where someone will be in a manic state for at least a day or more before shifting into hypomania or depression. And there's several other psychological disorders that share symptoms and features with DID, which can make it really difficult to correctly identify and diagnose. Because of this, there are several diagnostic tools developed specifically to identify dissociative identity disorder. Along with a thorough clinical interview, these tools are pivotal in diagnosing DID. First is the Structured Clinical Interview for DSM-4, Dissociative Disorders Revised, or SCID-D-R. Widely considered the gold standard for diagnosing dissociative disorders, this comprehensive semi-structured interview assesses the 5 core dissociative symptoms. Then there is the Dissociative Experiences Scale, or DES, which is a 28-item self-report questionnaire used as a screening tool to identify individuals who may have dissociative disorder. Next, we have the Dissociative Disorders Interview Schedule, DDIS, which is a highly structured interview that assesses for all dissociative disorders as well as common comorbid conditions like bipolar disorder, major depression, and somatization disorder. And last, there is the Multidimensional Inventory of Dissociation, or MID, which is a comprehensive 218-item self-report instrument that assesses 23 different dissociative symptoms and includes validity scales to help detect inconsistent reporting. So now we better understand what DID is and what its causes are, as well as what it takes to diagnose the disorder. But how can something this complicated be treated? Can someone with DID be treated so that they no longer suffer the condition and can carry on a more everyday life? Let's take a look at treatment plans and methods and see if we can figure that out. The primary and most effective treatment for DID is long-term, trauma-focused psychotherapy. Sorry, folks, there is no magic pill here. The ultimate goal of this psychotherapy is to integrate their distinct identity states into a single cohesive identity that can manage life's challenges without resorting to dissociation. This disorder is not a result of chemical imbalance, so medication generally does not work. But there are some medications that may be prescribed to treat specific symptoms that coexist with DID and complicate treatment. The accepted method for the psychotherapy sessions is to do this in a phased approach. Rather than just diving in headfirst and trying to sort out the entire disorder, approaching treatment this way breaks the therapy out into more manageable stages. This will allow the psychology professional to establish foundational skills to help the patient learn to cope with trauma and stress without dissociating. The first phase is establishing safety, stabilization, and symptom reduction. This is often the longest phase of the process. It's here that the therapist will help the patient feel emotionally and physically safe. For someone that's been through extremely traumatic events, especially as a child, this can take an excruciatingly long time. The therapist's goal is to establish an alliance with the patients to allow the patient to feel that the therapist is on their side and will not abandon them. Part of why this is so difficult is that people suffering DID often have experienced attachment disruptions. The key goals include educating the patient about the disorder, developing grounding techniques and coping skills to manage distressing symptoms like flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, and improving daily life functioning. Once the patient feels safe, stable, and has begun to learn how to manage their symptoms, we can move on to the second phase. If the first part was hard, the second part is more emotionally painful. It requires a very delicate approach. During this phase, the therapist focuses on confronting, working through, and integrating traumatic memories. The approach really has to be slow here and very calculated, or else the therapist runs the risk of re-traumatizing the patient. So focusing on one traumatic event or trigger at a time is key. The goal is not simply to recall the memories, but to transform them from fragmented, overwhelming experiences into a coherent narrative that can be integrated into the patient's unified personal history. This involves helping the various identities share and understand the traumatic experiences that they hold, thereby reducing amnesia and internal conflict. Then we come to the third phase, identity integration and rehabilitation. It's in this phase that the focus shifts to reconnecting the disparate identities into a single functioning self. This process, often referred to as integration or fusion, is about fostering cooperation and eventually merging the alternate identities into one. It's a collaborative process guided by the patient's readiness and goals. The therapeutic work then centers on helping the newly integrated person live in the present, grieve the losses associated with their past, and develop new life skills for navigating relationships, work, and personal fulfillment without reliance on dissociative defenses. Now, I'm not going to make any attempt to say that these three phases are simple or easy to work through, because the complexity of the condition, therapists have to use a variety of techniques and tools to work through each phase. Something that works one session may not work the next session because of the varying personality states. In some ways, you can almost think of it as having to develop a therapeutic process for each individual identity until they can all be incorporated into one sense of self. Some of the techniques and tools they employ during these phases include cognitive and behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. These are particularly useful in phase 1 for managing dysfunctional, trauma-based beliefs, improving emotional regulation, and building distress tolerance and interpersonal effectiveness skills. Clinical hypnosis, hypnotherapy, is used for calming, soothing, containment, and ego strengthening. It can also be used to help access repressed memories in a controlled manner, manage problematic behaviors, facilitate communication between identities, and assist in the integration process. Of course, the issues with repressed memories in hypnosis, therapists must be extremely cautious to not guide the patient into false memories. And the next one would be modified eye movement desensitization and reprocessing protocols, which are used to help process and desensitize traumatic material. Careful pacing and modification are essential to prevent destabilization in patients with DID. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is a method of using physical movements to act almost as a grounding tool while talking about traumatic events or memories. This could be moving the eyes from side to side as if they're following a pendulum or a metronome, tapping their hands or fingers on their knees, or some other motor function. It essentially allows the person to discuss the trauma while having some other movement that they can focus on doing while talking, rather than talking and focusing solely on the memory. So now, I mentioned previously that medication that specifically targets DID doesn't exist, but that other medications might be prescribed to manage other co-symptoms. These medications might include antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and in some cases even low-dose antipsychotics to help manage severe agitation, intrusive symptoms, or hyperarousal, but it is understood within the psychological community that these medications do not resolve DID itself and should not be heavily depended on for treatment, but rather used as a supplement to make treatments more effective. With proper treatment over a long period of time, patients can reintegrate the fragmented personalities into one personality again, which is great news for someone that suffers from this disorder. But people need to understand that it is not going to be a week in the hospital to recover or a couple of quick sessions with a therapist. This process can take months or even years. DID has long been a fascination of mine, as well as with society as a collective. I can remember watching television or movies and seeing it represented and thinking to myself that this was one of the scariest mental disorders out there. And when you think of the disorder on the surface, it definitely is. Imagine talking to one of your parents, siblings, or close friends, and suddenly, rather than the caring person you're used to talking to, you find yourself talking to a scared child or an angry old man. They look like the person you've always known, but they are definitely not the same person. The idea can really be terrifying, and it's pretty obvious why this would be a tool that Hollywood choose to use to instill a sense of unease and fear. As I got older and thought more about it, I started wondering whether or not it was even a real occurrence. I mean, how easy would it be to blame bad behavior or even a crime on a separate personality and that you don't even remember the event happening? It sounds like the easy way to get out of trouble, and all you have to do is disguise your voice and pretend a little bit. But with continuing my education and curiosity, it's become apparent to me, as I hope it has to many of you, that DID is a very real disorder, and recent advancements in psychology have curbed some of the overdiagnosis that's complicated this disorder in the public's eye. Before I wrap this up, there is another bit of curiosity that I had that I wanted to research and address as well. It's not worthy of a full episode, maybe someday in the future in a bonus episode, but it is definitely worth mentioning here because I really feel like there is a strong connection here. How many times in movie and literature, or maybe even in society, depending on your interests, have you heard of this happening? Someone has a traumatic event happen in their lives. After this event, they have periods of time where they claim to be someone else. They use a different voice, their entire demeanor changes. They become aggressive or violent, and suddenly they are their usual self again with no memory of what happened, or state that they knew what was happening, but some outside force was in control of their mind and body. If you take away what we've talked about today and you came across someone like this, what would your first thought be, especially if you were someone who is particularly spiritual or religious? For me, at least, thanks to Hollywood in particular, my mind might entertain the thought of demonic possession. Now, as with my mention in episode 3 about not wanting to turn this into a political podcast, I want to add a disclaimer here as well that I'm not in the business of trying to prove or disprove or debate any spiritual beliefs. We will talk about spiritual beliefs at some point in the future, but I'm not here to say that demonic possession doesn't happen or that it is strictly a psychological condition. Likewise, I'm also not here to say that this is a real thing, that, psychology is separate from the spiritual. However, there are some really fascinating overlaps between the classical description of demonic possession and dissociative identity disorder. Both possession and DID involve the sudden, noticeable replacement of the person's usual identity with a new one, often accompanied by a change in voice, mannerisms, or even behavior. In both cases, the individual may report a loss of memory for the time that the other entity, alter, or spirit was in control, a feeling of being a passive observer, or an inability to control their actions. Historically, claims of speaking in unknown languages or having clairvoyant knowledge are cited as evidence of possession, which can sometimes be explained in dissociative identity disorder as compartmentalized learning or complex dissociation. The most recent standard diagnostic manuals recognize the connection between possession experiences and dissociative disorders. In the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, it includes a specific presentation of DID called possession form. In this form, the alternate identities, alters, manifest as though they are outside agents, typically a supernatural being, spirit, or demon that has taken control of the person. Crucially, this is considered pathological only if the experience is unwanted, involuntary, causes substantial distress and impairment, and violates cultural or religious norms, as distinct from culturally accepted trance or possession in rituals. Case studies strongly link dissociative identity disorder to severe, repetitive, and early life trauma, as we've talked about. Many of the studies examining individuals who believe that they are possessed report a high prevalence of severe psychological or physical abuse or other potentially traumatizing events. The psychological view is that the quote-unquote demon or spirit may be an externalized, disowned, or traumatized part of the self, also known as an alter. The line between spiritual phenomena and the mental illness is heavily influenced by culture. In many non-Western societies and certain religious groups globally, trance and possession states are culturally sanctioned and part of accepted religious or healing rituals. These are generally not considered pathological. From the clinical perspective, mental health professionals are generally tasked with first ruling out any known medical or psychiatric conditions. Studies conclude that in most Western clinical settings, phenomena attributed to demonic possession can be explained as psychopathological conditions, often dissociative disorders like DID, or psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And then there's the harmful intervention risk. Some reports highlight that misdiagnosing a psychiatric disorder as demonic possession can be pretty harmful, as it may lead to the exclusion of medical or psychotherapeutic treatment and expose the treatment to coercive or traumatic exorcism practices. So, there's a lot to really kind of take in there, and it's some interesting food for thought that serves as kind of an extra anecdote to this episode. But this feels like a pretty good place to wrap things up for today. Here are some key takeaways from today's episode. Formerly known as multiple personality disorder, or even split personality, as I've heard it referred to often in my life, dissociative identity disorder is a very real and very complicated disorder. It has often been misdiagnosed as a myriad of other psychological conditions, and it has been overdiagnosed in the past due to attempts to recover repressed memories. This has led the disorder to be hotly debated as to what causes it and even whether or not it's a real condition or purely fantasy. Encountering someone with DID can be a terrifying experience, and thanks to popular culture, it often causes us to look at someone with the disorder as a scary person that could have a personality that is essentially Jack the Ripper. But as a society, we need to get away from this stereotyping and false view and instead recognize someone suffering this condition for what they are, a victim. Nearly every single person with this disorder has endured some kind of prolonged, severe trauma, usually as a child, that forced them to have to fragment their mind into different personas to help them endure and survive. These are, by the very definition, the most broken people that desperately need to work with a therapist to properly heal themselves. And I want to say this with plenty of emphasis. These are not monsters. They are victims. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and have learned some things along the way. I know that this has been a bit of a supersized episode compared to our episodes in the past. And I want to thank you for sticking with me through the whole thing. I hope you're enjoying the podcast in and of itself. I don't want to just focus in on one particular stance or discussion type within psychology. So some weeks will be studies, some weeks will be disorders, and others like last week where we discuss strategies for managing our own lives. Again, your feedback is invaluable to me. I want to make sure that this podcast is as enjoyable as possible for those of us with a strong curiosity about the world of psychology. So if you have comments, suggestions, or thoughts, please feel free to email me anytime at hello@yourmindonpodcast.com or reach out via Instagram at yourmindonpodcast. Don't forget to rate the podcast and tell your friends and family. Word of mouth is actually the best way to spread the podcast around. And the more listeners we have, the more I can improve the quality and content of the podcast and even work on some bonus episode ideas that I have. Next week, we will look at another psychological condition or disorder, but this time it's something new. Very new, in fact. First truly defined in late summer of 2025. We're going to be discussing AI-induced psychosis. This is a phenomenon that is on the rise and has been newly identified, and technically is not even a psychological diagnosis at this point. As the computer and technological world expands, we do need to stop and consider the implications of these interactions that we're having. In the past, this usually meant examining the impacts these advancements would have on jobs and society. But with artificial intelligence, it shouldn't really be that surprising that we have an entirely new branch forming in the tree of psychology. How does using large language models and AI chatbots impact our minds? Can the simple act of interacting with AI regularly change our mindsets or even cause psychological conditions? Join me next Thursday as we dive into uncharted waters and explore how AI and our psychological selves interact. Once again, thank you for listening today. I'm John Shaw, and remember, understanding your mind is the first step in changing your life. Until next time, be kind to yourself.